We're all familiar with the acronym LGBT, aren't we? It's part of the foundation of the queer community and the furthering of queer rights. A stepping stone into the legalization of same-sex marriage in Canada, the fourth country in the world to do so. Continuing on to include gender identity and expression in the Canadian Human Rights Act in 2017. And we continue to push right up to the modern day. Conversion therapy has been made illegal nationwide as of December 1st, 2021. Just like our rights have evolved, our acronym has evolved too. Today, the most common acronym used is LGBTQ+, and I'll break down what each letter represents. We of course have the L and the G, which represents women attracted to women and men attracted to men. The B represents bisexual, someone attracted to more than one gender. The T, of course, representing trans people whose gender identity is not aligned with their birth sex, whether that be male to female or female to male. Now on to the newer additions. Queer often refers to those who opt out of a label for their sexuality, gender identity, or both. And finally, the plus. There is a wide variety of sexualities and gender identities people possess. A common one popping up in our modern day is non-binary. The term describes an individual's gender identity being one that doesn't neatly fit into the binary of male or female. That sounds simple enough, right? Let's see what people on the internet have to say.
You simply cannot sweep fundamental aspects of human biology, for example biological sex, under an ideological rug and not expect enormous harms and absurdities to start manifesting all over the place.
Protect kids from the gender cult. Protect kids from being taught they are born in the wrong body, for picking up the wrong toy. Protect kids from homophobic parents transing them to make them straight. Protect kids from being taught mind-body dissociation. No BC, everyone has a gender
Pray
stop
for you, that's
pretending you
disgusting. We will
don't.
not accept this
Yes,
for our
then
children. Not biblical, not true fantasy of what you guys want people to believe. No such thing as this gender. For well, God made you with prematures, but trying to stop with your lies and trying to get our generation to believe those false lies. I was born 1990 and I've been around, so don't.
No one gives a about your pronouns. Move on. Go about your day and stop shoving bullshit down everyone's throat. No one has to submit to your ridiculous ideology, winky face.
Well, those were just awful. Look, I don't fully understand gender or non-binary either, but I could never imagine saying anything like that. Unfortunately, people discriminate against what they don't understand, and despite the legal progress that we've made, societal progress still has a little bit of a way to go. So for those of you who are trying to expand your mind and want to have a better understanding because you just simply don't understand, I ask you to join myself, a gender scholar, and some non-binary individuals to really get a grasp on what gender is and what exactly non-binary is. First things first, what exactly is gender? I'll be sitting down over Zoom with gender scholar and college professor Alex Dragich, and she's going to give us all the information you and I need to know about gender.
Hi, I'm Alex Dragich. My pronouns are she, her.
Can you explain the difference between sex and gender?
Gender is this complex web of interactions and these interrelationships between different dimensions. And these dimensions are the body, so the body, which is this unique site, this unique location that we all have, and identity, an identity that we internalize about ourselves. So it lives within, the realm of this site of the body. All of this interacts with these sociocultural ideas and perceptions and representations of gender. So if you think about it kind of like a wheel or like an orb that sort of moves from the inside of the person and is active in the external world. So it's constantly sort of moving and evolving. So the body, the personal site, identity as it's internalized, and how it interacts with the socio-cultural ideas around gender. What's assumed about gender in a community, for example. The standards that are upheld in a society about gender. And then sex. It's the biological and physiological characteristics. So for example, male intersects female. These are sex categories. So when we say like masculine or feminine or non-binary or gender fluid, these are gender categories. These interact with each other, but they are distinct from each other as well. Our Western history has long used sex and gender interchangeably. And so this is something that we have worked, scholars and thinkers and Indigenous leaders have worked very hard to create and present and argue the distinction.
Okay, so what is the difference between gender expression and gender identity?
So gender identity is the way that a person experiences and internalizes their sense of gender, and which really influences their sense of self. So gender identity isn't something that's just static and decided, but it's something that is in evolution. A person's gender identity may be the same or different than the birth sex that they were assigned. And gender expression, that's how a person, presents and expresses their gender to themselves and to the world. Like clothing, voice, body language, gender pronouns, all of these things have like a palette that we use to express our gender.
Can you explain what gender dysphoria is and what gender euphoria is?
Euphoria comes from the root word euphoris, which means born well. There's a resonance of health and wellness. And dysphoria comes from dysphoris. So that's the opposite. So that's hard to bear. So if there's a discord between a person's sort of sex characteristics and the gender that they are, there is a dysphoria. There's discord. There's an unwellness because the identity isn't able to be confluent. It isn't able to match up. And so gender euphoria is thought of almost ecstatic experience of feeling right, of feeling that the body, this site, this personal site that is sex, is in accord with the gender that one feels that they are.
What do you believe is the biggest misconception surrounding gender identities outside of the binary?
There's a misconception that difference or an opposition or something that varies from a standard is unnatural. But the interesting thing is that this binary understanding is something that was fashioned and created by humans, just like all of society was. Standard that has been upheld and maintained for centuries and decades is that, you have an assigned male at birth, for example, who then is masculine and is then sexually drawn to and attracted to women. Then you have the female who is female and feminine and attracted to male. But in fact, what is also natural is a male, an assigned male at birth, who identifies as non-binary or gender non-conforming or gender fluid or queer, who is pansexual, meaning attracted to all genders. And so there's this misconception that if gender somehow transcends or doesn't interact in this binary code, considered unnatural, when in fact it is natural. Trans people have been here for a very long time. And gender fluid folk have been here for a very long time.
Based on your knowledge, what do you feel is the biggest contributing factor to discrimination against those who are non-binary?
It's this inability to negotiate difference. And difference can be very threatening if you don't know how to handle it. If you perceive it to threaten your way of life, if you perceive it that way, then you develop a very sort of unhealthy or toxic approach to difference. And you might have an inclination to have things remain the same. If something is not something you understand and is different than what you're used to, then it's scary, right? It's something that you might fear. So what are you going to do? You might think of it as like a villain in a fairy tale, or pathologize it as something that, again, is unnatural, because you might not have an entry point to understand it. And so I think it's negotiating how you want to interact with something that is outside of your comfort zone.
When did discussions around gender change to what they are today?
It's very hard to say, like, where are we at? When did this change happen? Because, I mean, we have to think about the fact that pre-contact, we have had Indigenous cultures that have embraced a diverse sort of expression of gender and sexuality. In some ways, you know, we've progressed, and in some ways we've digressed. So I think, like, history doesn't really necessarily work in progress. It spirals all the time. And there's things that improve, there are things that are lost. And so we're always trying to kind of figure it out. There are like these sort of micro environments in which I think gender and how expansive gender is understood and observed and appreciated, and not just tolerated and accepted, but loved. And that there are other environments outside of those that have other kinds of standards and haven't been able to embrace that.
All right, well, that's all the questions I have for you. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this interview, and thank you so much for all the great information that you brought forward today. Now that we understand what gender is and isn't, it's important to hear the perspectives of those who have that lived experience. With me, I have two wonderful non-binary people who are more than willing to share their stories and experiences. I'll allow them to introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is Eve Diamond.
My name is Jay Vanderhayden. My pronouns are they, them.
I am a prop maker and dressmaker for theater.
I'm also known as Iron Thighs or the Battle Bard, depending on where you see me. I am in fact non-binary gender fluid.
And I use they, them pronouns. I've been out as strictly non-binary for, I guess it was only a couple months.
I came out a couple years back. It was something that surprised some people and absolutely didn't surprise others. For myself, it took me a couple of years to really put the pieces together, but I'm very happy to have been out for a couple years now. Realizing that I was a non-binary individual didn't happen overnight.
It was a little chaotic. It started with a question from my friend, who kind of triggered the whole thing.
It was things like seeing other people post on social media and going, oh, I relate to that. It was attending groups and socials where other people were very openly queer, and me being able to go, wow, I'd never met anybody else like me before. And it was all of those things combined over my own life experiences here and there that just really shone a light on it, and I can't thank those people enough.
I had my friends use all pronouns they, she, and her for me, and I noticed that the she, her, and the he, him still never quite fit, still felt a little wrong. And it was when one of my friends was like, do you want to just try going straight, they, them? And so we did, we tried it, they did it for me, they were very lovely. And turns out they were very correct.
I actually learned about different gender and identity phrases and terms through live action roleplay. It was one of the first times that I was able to experience a community with so much queer representation, and I really started to feel at home. It was something where I could go out and become different people for a weekend. I could immerse myself in a fantasy world with other colorful characters.
It was through other people, my friends who were part of the community were like, oh yeah, these things exist. I'm like, oh, good to know. Because up until that point, I was living under a rock.
Due to the involvement that I previously had in any sort of church atmosphere, it was terrifying to come out.
I'd say the biggest factor would be my parents and my family. My parents are very Catholic. They believe in all the ideologies of the faith very strongly.
I do not want to use this as an opportunity to smack talk anyone's religion or beliefs, but I was put in a situation where it was not my choice to attend, and the beliefs that were put upon me were not my own.
And if you are unaware, such things as gender and sexuality are that you are as God made you. And that's the end of it.
It was something that really took away from who I was. And I felt very washed into becoming what they expected me to be. Now, whether or not that was their intention, that was the result. Family was a little bit of a struggle for me. My mother was very encouraging growing up, and she allowed me to experience all sorts of different colors under the rainbow. That said, she kind of always looked at me like, "What's wrong with you? Like, are you my kid?" But she always let me explore whatever I wanted to. That said, I do come from a broken home, so going over to my dad's side, it was a very different atmosphere, and as much as they were never specifically unaccepting, there was just almost a level of animosity because of the divorce that had happened there that made it even harder for me and my father to connect. So when I would go over there, I felt like I had to kind of shut myself down even before anything gender questioning wise came up. And then when I'd go back to see my mom again, it was really hard to kind of reopen those discussions and conversations.
My parents were less inclined. I had actually come out previous as gender fluid as I was still figuring everything out. And I knew that if I had to come out again to them, especially, they'd be like, "Oh, are you suddenly changing your mind?" And I'm like, "Well, actually, I'm doing the working on myself that I was unable to do under your roof, but okay." So I came out to them a second time, and they finally realized this is indeed something that they will need to face and learn to live with. As of this point, they do not use any pronouns that I ask. Kind of ignore it at the moment, but we are trying to find a middle ground. My brothers, one of them is of the same opinion as my parents, but the other one, the oldest one, my brother Philip, he is sort of what you'd expect should happen. When I told him and his wife, their immediate reaction was, "Good for you. I'm proud of you." And I'm like, wow, this is what acceptance feels like. And I even got a message asking if he could talk to me, take me out for like coffee or something, and just know how he could support me better. And I'm like, aw, thanks, Philip.
Later in life, as I have grown in confidence, it's become easier for me to maintain these conversations. And when some of my more opinionated family members go, "Well, why do you do that?" I'm able to understand now that it's not so much that they're disapproving of my choices, it's more that they're just actually curious and want to hear more and just don't always know how to phrase it in the nicest way. I absolutely experience gender dysphoria, and it's a little bit difficult to describe to somebody who doesn't experience any sort of dysphoria or disconnect.
I do experience both. It's different for every non-binary, for what they feel doesn't fit.
Everybody will have different triggers or different safe zones.
For me, it is mainly my chest that I am not a fan of, so that's where the biggest dysphoria comes from. So I am currently just wearing binders to get rid of as much definition as I can. I'm also looking into getting top surgery, so that's a work in progress. I'm very excited for that, and it's going smoothly thus far.
For me, I absolutely do not like being called her, she, ma'am. Shove it. It completely disjoints me. And it's really difficult to communicate that in the moment because it's so viscerally upsetting that if I were to not have a script, which I try to, I'd probably say something I regret because it's upsetting to my core. I suddenly feel drawn back from my attention. I've had a lot of struggles with an anxiety condition, and it's something that's made it very difficult for me to speak up in my life, and that's something that I have to work hard to overcome, because the best way that I can overcome it is when somebody does misgender me, I need to be able to stick up for myself even when it's hard. I really enjoy actually having friends around me that will correct somebody on my behalf because I struggle with it. And even though that is me, that is my truth, that is my identity, it can be really difficult to push through such a disorienting experience.
As for gender euphoria, surprisingly, sort of muscle structure, I have very much caught myself flexing in the mirror because who hasn't? Let's be real, who hasn't? And I'm lucky enough that there's only one main aspect that I wasn't a fan of that I can't immediately change. For example, like hair. It's very easy. I did a big chop. Finally figured out how to properly take care of short hair. And I'm loving it. It looks fantastic. I'm feeling myself. It is really unfortunate when dysphoria hits and there's nothing you can do for it.
It is a little bit hard for me to discuss the euphoria because I'm still kind of figuring that out. I used to do a lot of cosplay, and I feel like that's a pretty good gateway for a lot of people figuring out their identities, because it gives you so many opportunities to become a different character and put on different clothes and look at yourself in the mirror in a very different way. And that experimentation helped me a lot to kind of coin my own personal style. Nowadays, I feel the most euphoric when I'm in my own clothes, and by that I mean I made them with my own 2 hands, and they look exactly the way that I want them to. For me, the euphoria comes more from, I want to do this in this moment. The presentation is almost for other people. I think there are a lot of misconceptions when it comes to any sort of gender or personal identity, and I can't really pick just one. For me, in my experiences, it comes from not knowing. You don't know anybody queer in your life, so you make assumptions. You've only seen some crazy balls to the walls, insane stuff online, so that's your only frame of reference for what queer is. When you don't know something and you form a biased opinion based on a lack of information, that's just a really negative thing, not just for the people that you're forming the opinion about, but for your own personal growth as an individual, whether you might be a queer identifying individual down the line, or if you stay as a cis-het person.
Oftentimes, and I find this with older generations, they always seem to think that we're either too young or can't say for ourselves who we are, as if we haven't thought about it enough, or that we shouldn't be able to make such a decision for ourselves. I suppose I don't really understand why they feel they need to know, or why it has anything to do with them, because we don't go asking them why they chose to marry or like who they did. Why are we any different?
People have a natural curiosity, which these days I try really hard to fuel. If you want to ask me questions, I would rather sit and have an awkward conversation with you to avoid upsetting ones in the future. Here's a fun one for you. So I did some work for a stock race camera crew, and it was a bunch of dudes with cameras and sweat on their brows, and I show up with my hawk, and the one guy was just so confused and befuddled, but in the most positive of ways. We had like 5 minutes to be on break. And he sits down beside me and goes, okay, so I don't want this to be like too personal, but do you mind if I ask you some questions? I'm so curious. And he was just so nice, but he dove right into it, started asking me about my gender identity and how I managed to come around to they, them pronouns. And here I'm sitting here like, I just get paid to do the camera, man. But I did my best, because if I were to shut down that conversation as the queer representation in that very heavily cis-het male environment, they would have never had that positive experience with a queer individual to be able to then go on and share about with their friends and family to open that discussion and create more acceptance in the world. There are so many ways that you can be an ally to your non-binary friends, to your queer friends, your LGBTQ+ members.
In a workplace, if you have a name tag, say you work at a grocery store, like a retail store, you can have the option to put your pronouns straight on your name tag.
If you have any sort of email sign-off, social media, anything with a screen name, and you have the option to include a pronoun, do it. Even if you think it's obvious to you, do it. Because the fact that you include yours is going to make other people who need to differentiate themselves and need to reiterate what theirs are, they're going to feel more comfortable doing it for themselves. as well as it's a clear indicator that you're willing to listen to other people's pronouns and to help others get gendered correctly. It is something that I love to practice where, especially if you have any sort of service job and you need to talk to somebody in a way that you might have to use a pronoun or gender them, right off the bat, just say, hey, what's your pronoun? You might feel like you don't have to ask. But even when somebody goes, oh, well, I'm he, or I'm she.
And if ever you are in doubt, just ask. If you don't know, just ask.
You can do this practice with anybody, because when you do meet that person that says, oh, my pronouns are they, or someone you thought was she introduces themselves as he, you're doing such a good thing for them, because now they feel much more comfortable around you, and you have proven yourself to be someone that is going to be supportive of them in general and just their existence.
Don't be too quick to judge based on appearances alone. For example, what pronouns you use.
You need to understand that certain questions are too far. Do not ask somebody what's in their pants. Not only is that disrespectful, that's disgusting. You wouldn't do that to your friend Bob, who's a cis-het male. You're not gonna go over to the family barbecue and go up to Grandpa and say, hey Grandpa, what you rocking in your pants today? So why on earth would you ever do that to somebody that you're not able to tell right off the bat? Take a moment, consider the feelings of those around you, and imagine if somebody were to ask you those kinds of probing questions. Find the questions that get the answers you need to be able to make other people comfortable, and don't push your questions into making people uncomfortable. If you're out there and you're questioning your own identity, maybe you feel like you don't fit the mold that you were initially provided, or you've had some experiences that are opening your mind. First and foremost, ask questions. Do some research, get some credible sources, and find some others that actually can give you real life experience in a positive manner.
The best advice I have, if you haven't found it already, find someone or several people who you can talk through it with. If you can't find that in family, go to friends. If you can't, we have the wonderful internet, and you can connect to so many people.
You can't deny the basics of who you are and what your body wants and craves and desires, but you also can't deny the experiences that have shaped you and helped form you. And the more exploration you can do, the more experiences you can have and add into your repertoire, it expands you as a person as well as educates you on who you are, which is one of the biggest questions you can ever ask yourself.
Those were very inspiring and very powerful statements and stories. It is so important for queer people to share their experiences and perspectives. When queer people do that, it helps to normalize these identities. In a way, we're really lucky right now. There are so many queer people that are out and proud in our modern day. For example, JoJo Siwa coming out as queer and being part of the first ever same-sex couple on Dancing with the Stars. Elliot Page's character on the Umbrella Academy having an arc where they come out as trans, coinciding with Page's own gender identity. Sam Smith and Demi Lovato being out and proud as non-binary individuals. Every day, queer identities are becoming more and more known. Unfortunately, many countries still have anti-queer laws, and some countries are passing legislation that actively harms the LGBTQ+ community, especially minors, going as far as to prevent discussions of subjects such as gender identity and sexuality in a classroom setting. As Alex, Eve, and Jay have described, people discriminate against what they don't understand. And the more we have these discussions and the more people open their minds to these new identities, the more accepting and safe our world can be. At the end of the day, we're all human. I thank you all for coming on this journey with me. I hope that you learned something, and here's to a brighter and more positive, accepting, and safe future.
That I do a back bend, so I'd be doing enough sit-down for while standing there by this time.